Welcome to AEIOU, a podcast about Austria. I'm Andrew, your host. We established in the last episode that the final Habsburg Emperor, Karl, did not abdicate the throne with the end of World War I. Rather, he recognized the independence of German Austrians and swore not to interfere in their state building. Indeed, at that point, the German Austrians were the only Austrians left. You might recall from previous episodes that the German nationalist parties had banded together in the final Imperial Reichsrat to form the Deutscher Nationalverband, or German National Association. Two additional German parties stood outside the National Verband. These parties were the Christian Social Party and the Social Democratic Party. With the declarations of independence of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Ukraine in the final days of World War I, the German Austrians in these three Reichsrat groups declared themselves a provisional government. However, the three groups had different visions for the future of German Austrians. The National Verband was the largest of the three groups. It sought Anschluss, or union with Germany, the empire of which was also being dismantled. The third largest group, the Social Democrats, as a socialist party in favor of building an internationalist movement, also favored Anschluss. The Christian Socials, in contrast, held out hope that the Habsburg dynasty would prevail in the end. They did not back Anschluss. With Emperor Karl's non-abdication of November 11th, 1918, the provisional government proclaimed a Republic of German Austria, doing so the very next day. It also promulgated a constitution declaring the goal of eventual Anschluss with Germany. Meanwhile, across the border, Germany had erupted into a full-scale revolution. While a republic had been declared there as well, it was uncertain what form it would ultimately take, given the refusal of both the far left and the far right to recognize it. In part to establish some stability on which to build, as well as to temporarily placate the more radical elements of its own Social Democrats, the Republic of German Austria appointed the Social Democrat Karl Renner as the provisional chancellor and promised elections in the coming months. These elections were held in February 1919, with the Social Democrats winning 40% of the vote and nearly half the seats in the new Constituent Assembly, which had replaced the Reichsrat. The Christian Socials finished second with nearly as many seats, while the German Nationals finished with slightly less than 20%. Renner continued as chancellor. Among the first pieces of business handled by the new government was the so-called Habsburg Law. Passed in the aftermath of Emperor Karl's departure from the country on March 19, 1919, without formally abdicating, the law formally declared that the Habsburg dynasty no longer ruled Austria, and declared dozens of Habsburg family members, including the emperor, unwelcome in the new republic, seizing their property to boot. The other main orders of business were negotiating the Anschluss and the final peace treaty with the victorious Allied powers. A draft of the treaty was presented in June 1919, at which point the issue of Anschluss became moot because the victors had specifically forbidden it. This restriction was written into Article 88 of the final treaty, called the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The treaty was also notable for stripping German Austria of several German-majority areas it had claimed for itself, most importantly the Sudetenland, which was given to Czechoslovakia. Additionally, as promised before Italy's entry into the war, South Tyrol was given to Italy, as well as the city of Trieste on the Adriatic. The remainder of Austria's holdings in the Adriatic and Balkan regions were given to Yugoslavia. One exception was the city of Fiume, which became an international city like Danzig. These territorial revisions were painful for the German Austrians to accept, but they had no recourse given their position as the defeated side in the war. Some consolation was found in the fact that the German Austrians were able to retain Burgenland and Carinthia despite the other territorial losses. Chancellor Renner signed the treaty in September, and the Constituent Assembly ratified it a month later. Per the terms of the treaty, the name of the country was changed from the Republic of German Austria to the Republic of Austria. A new constitution was approved in October of the following year. Less than 3 weeks later, elections for a new National Council, or National Rat, were held. The Christian Socials won 42% of the vote, with the Social Democrats winning 36%, and the newly dubbed Greater German People's Party, or GDVP, winning 13%. These three parties would dominate Austrian politics for the next 12 years or so. Michael Mayer, the Christian social leader who had taken the office of chancellor when Renner's government fell a few months earlier, continued in his role as chancellor. Because no single party held a majority of votes in the National Rat, Mayer formed a government with the Social Democrats. This would be the last government to include the Social Democrats, however. Widespread dissatisfaction with the ban against Anschluss and the post-war economic contraction experienced all over Europe resulted in Mayer's government falling in June 1921. Every subsequent government until the end of democracy in 1933 consisted of the Christian Socials and the GDVP, with the Social Democrats in opposition. The government was not the only thing divided between the Christian Socials and GDVP on the one hand, and the Social Democrats on the other hand. Indeed, the entire country was divided, although the distribution of the two parties across the country was quite different. Whereas the Christian Socials and GDVP enjoyed widespread support throughout the entire country, support for the Social Democrats was largely confined to the capital city of Vienna and other major cities. Of a population of roughly 6.5 million people in 1920, nearly 1 in 3 Austrians lived in Vienna. Given the support for the Social Democrats in Vienna, the capital was frequently referred to as Red Vienna. The support for the different political parties indicated more than political priorities. It also indicated class, religion, and social values. As we discussed several episodes ago, the Christian Socials were a party of the petty bourgeois artisanal class, while the Social Democrats were a working-class party that drew its support for the urban proletariat. Moreover, while only 10% of the Austrian population during the First Republic was not Catholic, this 10%, which was largely Jewish, was concentrated in the cities. Fully 90% of the Jews in Austria lived in the capital city, with smaller populations spread throughout the country in cities and larger towns. Finally, supporters of the Social Democrats tended to hold progressive social views and wanted to see changes in the country regarding more permissive social attitudes. In contrast, supporters of the Christian Socials were traditional in their viewpoints and largely held the conservative values of the countryside. It has often been said that two Austrias emerged in the period between the world wars, and given the sharp divide between Vienna and the rest of the country, it is difficult to disagree. The other thing about this division in the population is that because the Social Democrats were excluded from power for the vast majority of the period between the wars, the party's supporters felt that their concerns about the country and its direction were ignored. They could have some impact on local government, particularly in the capital, but in terms of policy that would be applied from Vorarlberg in the west to Burgenland in the east, the Social Democrat voter was shut out. Importantly, the First Republic was a country with plenty of problems to manage. Economic problems were the biggest. During the Habsburg era, Austria had obtained necessities for living largely from within the borders of its own quite large empire. However, with the end of the war and the Treaty of Saint-Germain, the country was now 88% smaller and could not obtain these necessities without paying much more for them. This basic issue was compounded by several others, including the entry into the new Republic of German speakers from the outlying former Crown lands, widespread unemployment, and a reparations regime imposed upon the country by the victorious Allies. Although these reparations were not nearly as draconian as those imposed upon Germany, they were nevertheless a major stress on the new country's fragile economic health. To combat hunger, the government in the early 1920s provided relief in the form of cash payments, resulting in inflation that worsened with the need to run large annual budget deficits. Since there was little ability to collect sufficient revenue in taxation, the Austrian krona went from an exchange rate with the US dollar of 17 to 1 in January 1919 to more than 75,000 to 1 in August 1922. Austria appealed to the League of Nations for help in restructuring its economy, and in October 1922 a loan of 650 million krona was extended to the struggling country under the condition that it manage its economy more efficiently. By 1925, under a policy of austerity, the government was running a budget surplus. Additionally, a new currency, the shilling, was introduced, which replaced the krona at a rate of 10,000 krona to 1 shilling. Much of the work of changing Austria's economic trajectory during this period was undertaken by Chancellor and Christian Social Party chair Ignaz Seipel, who took office in May 1922 and led the Christian Socials to an electoral victory in 1923. Seipel was a Catholic priest in addition to being a politician, so to some extent he embodied one of the chief values of the Christian Socials, Austria as a Catholic society and nation. There was widespread suffering across the country with the new regime of austerity that Seipel was implementing. During this process of changing economic course, Seipel survived an assassination attempt. On June 1st, 1924, he was shot by Karl Jarovec on a Vienna train station platform. Jarovec, who was immediately caught and who served 5 years in prison at hard labor, claimed he shot Seipel because the chancellor was responsible for the starvation of his family. Seipel was struck in the lung but underwent a successful surgery that extracted the bullet. Nevertheless, he resigned a few months later. Seipel was succeeded as chancellor by Rudolf Ramek, who implemented the currency reform mentioned a few minutes ago. However, Ramek spent less than 2 years in office, with his government brought down by a crisis surrounding the Austria Postal Savings Bank. A postal savings bank, since you asked, is a service provided via a country's post office that provides banking services to people without access to banks, people we refer to today as unbanked. The operations of the postal bank had shrunk precipitously since the war, leaving many unbanked people without access to financial services at all. This was a serious problem, particularly with the ongoing economic difficulties that the country faced. Even with the economic restructuring, the Social Democrats were able to make hay of the issue and bring down Ramek's government in October 1926. Seipel returned to office and promptly privatized the postal bank, which did not solve the problem of lack of access to banking, but did take away the Social Democrats' ability to blame the government for the bank's shortcomings. Seipel would lead the Christian Socials to another electoral victory, April 1927. However, how he won that election and the means he would use to keep his party in power for the next 6 years is another story. We'll tell that story in the next episode. Thanks for listening.